DevilNeverCry.
Square Enix have decided to drop 18 new minutes of Final Fantasy XVI footage on us, and, once more, they're teasing that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will make an appearance sooner than expected. We're just 14 days away from the release of Final Fantasy XVI, and Square Enix are not letting up on the throttle when it comes to marketing material. In this latest 18-minute piece of footage, we see Clive, Cid, and Jill make their way through two distinct dungeons as they fight their way to their main objective. It also goes without saying that Torgal, Clive's trusted canine companion, also accompanies the party deep within these dungeons. These so-called dungeons are known colloquially in Final Fantasy XVI as stages. These are areas of the game that have been sequestered away, and typically you often only visit once, as they're often tied to some form of objective, whether it's a main quest or a side quest. The complete opposite to these areas are known as fields. These are going to be the large open areas that you'll constantly be revisiting and traversing through as you make your way around the world of Valisthea. Now, that doesn't mean that just because you visit these stages once that you're not going to be able to return. Final Fantasy XVI does indeed have a stage replay feature, which will allow you to go back to these stages over and over as many times as you need to if you've missed out on items or armor or gear, or simply if you just want to go through and find these enemies again. The footage from IGN shows Clive and the party going from room to room, wiping out all who stand in their way. The video gives you a strong semblance of what you'll likely be doing most throughout Final Fantasy XVI, exploring and fighting, but it also gives you a sense of the atmosphere of Final Fantasy XVI, and more importantly, its levity. Sure, the game has been likened to Game of Thrones, known to be dark, brooding, and focusing heavily on Clive's quest for revenge, at least initially, but it's thanks to these moments of levity where Clive is bantering away with Cid or discussing things out with Jill that give contrast to these dark and brooding scenes that give them more of an impact. The only reason that I bring this up is because I know there are a few fans out there concerned that this game will be overly grimdark, when of course that likely was never the case from the beginning. There's a sequence in this footage where Cid and Clive have to bust down a gate to make their way towards the objective, and of course Cid can't do so without throwing out a few dad jokes. Much to my own enjoyment, by the way. I'm a sucker for a good dad joke, but one of the questions that I see being brought up quite often is the idea that because Cid and Clive both wield the power of icons, surely they could have just blasted this gate right open as opposed to kicking it down like feeble humans. And the reason for doing so comes in two halves. The first of which is the fact that it's implied that Cid and Clive and the rest of the party are going through this location as stealthily as possible, and so popping off at the first chance they get is likely to attract some unwanted attention. The second reason pertains to the phenomena that occurs whenever a dominant uses the power of their inherent icon, petrification. They touched upon this idea in one of the earlier trailers for Final Fantasy XVI, where it's implied that through the constant use of the power of the icon that they wield, the user, the dominant, slowly begins to petrify until they meet an untimely end. And as such, I'd imagine that Cid only uses the power of Ramuh, his icon, whenever he has to. All in all, if this gameplay is anything to go by, I think the game is shaping up to be quite promising. Though there is more to talk about, particularly the cutscenes and their story implications, I know that not everybody wants to be hearing about that so close to launch, and as such, we'll move on to a new article that Square Enix dropped that sheds more light on the characters of Final Fantasy XVI. One of the first characters I want to touch upon is Joshua, Clive's younger brother. As like most younger brothers, Joshua deeply admires Clive. However, we come to learn that he often regrets the fact that it was he who inherited the power of the Phoenix instead of his older brother Clive, particularly because Clive is brave and outgoing, and Joshua is quite fragile and frail. Moving on, we also come to find out that both Jill and Torgal were rescued from the Northern Territories. We don't necessarily know how it came to be that Jill eventually became a ward of Rosaria at such a young age, but it's implied here that Torgal was actually rescued from a freezing snowfield during one of the Archduke's expeditions up towards the freezing north. The Archduke in question, of course, being Elwyn, Clive and Joshua's father, who actually gifted his son to Torgal upon his return home. That then brings us on to Cidolfus Telamon, or as he's more commonly known as, Cid. A former soldier of the Waluda army, Cid's current goal is to simply build a place where persecuted magic wielders, aka bearers, and exploited dominants can simply live and die on their own terms. It also mentions that he's a man of science, apparently conducting research into how someone may live in the Deadlands, an area that has been affected by the Blight, but part of me also wonders if Sid is doing any research into attempting to prevent or actually reverse petrification in dominance. That there is my own personal theory, but it certainly would fit the man of science moniker that he seems to have. Moving on, we also come to learn a little bit more about Dion, the crown prince of the Holy Empire of Sanbreque, and also the dominant of the icon Bahamut. Though we know that he is loved and respected by both his people and his troops, the implication here is that not all is well in the Sanbreque army, and that apparently gathering shadows may be enough to quell the light of Bahamut, with the gathering shadows in question implied to be Barnabas, the dominant of Odin, a simple wanderer who through his own strength alone subjugated an entire continent and brought them all under his rule. I can imagine that Barnabas simply wants to rule the entirety of Valisthea, or perhaps he's sick and tired of dominants themselves being used as tools and wants to have dominance reign over everyone else. Perhaps it's that dubious goal of wanting to take over the world that caused Sid to simply desert the kingdom of Waloed. Regardless of theories, however, and whether or not you decide to believe in them, Final Fantasy XVI seems to have quite a complex cast of characters, and I can't wait to see how the dice are cast in this supposed game of fate. Moving on to the last topic that I briefly want to cover today, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In a previous recent video, I discussed the fact that mysteriously out of nowhere, the developers behind Final Fantasy VII Rebirth were leaving answers to community questions on a daily basis. These answers, of course, were incredibly cryptic and vague, causing people, of course, to meme these answers, stating that yes, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will have characters and, by surprise, it will have gameplay as well. But when we come to the 7th comment, which dropped today, a mere hours ago, the question was, when can I find out more about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? With the answer being, more information will be revealed soon. And that comment came from the creative director himself, Tetsuya Nomura. Now I feel as though I likely don't have to spell this out, but considering that we are on the eve of Summer Game Fest, I'd imagine, or I would like to imagine, as a fan of Final Fantasy, that we'll be getting a new trailer today perhaps? One can only hope. After all, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is slated to be releasing winter 2023, which, alarmingly, is just around the corner. Most of all, however, if we do get a trailer, I'm hoping that we get an extensive look at the gameplay of FF7 Rebirth, particularly some of the open areas that would represent the open world from the original PS1 title. Maybe this is where Square Enix decide to go completely off the rails and we follow the adventures of Zack and Genesis as they traverse the land of Gaia. I know somewhere out there somebody got a shiver down that spine just hearing that statement. With that said though, I would be curious to see what your theories are in regards to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and whether or not we'll get a trailer. Let me down in the comments below as to what you think we'll be featuring, and you can come back to this video to see just how right or how wrong we all were. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.